The call came in at 9:14 on a Wednesday night, exactly 1 week after we'd closed on the house, and I almost didn't answer it because the number wasn't saved in my phone and I was standing in my new kitchen, still surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, exhausted in that particular way that only moving into a new home can make a person exhausted. Something made me pick up anyway. "Hello?" A woman's voice came through, tight and trembling, barely above a whisper, the kind of voice you use when you're afraid someone nearby might overhear you. "Is this Rachel?" "Rachel Turner?" "Yes, who is this?" A long pause followed, long enough that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to check the call was still connected. "This is Eleanor Voss," she finally said. "I used to own the house you're living in now." My first thought was simple, almost pleasant, the friendly kind of call you sometimes get from a previous owner checking in, wanting to know how the garden was doing, maybe. That thought lasted exactly as long as it took her to speak her next sentence. "Please," she said, her voice cracking slightly on the word, "don't tell your husband I called." I stood completely still in my kitchen, one hand braced against the counter, feeling something shift in the air around me, the particular stillness that arrives right before you understand a conversation is about to become something you never expected it to be. "Why would that matter?" I asked carefully, and I heard her breathe in sharply on the other end of the line, like she was gathering courage for something she'd clearly been rehearsing and still wasn't fully ready to say out loud. "Because he already knows exactly why I'm calling," she said. "And if he finds out I warned you first, I don't know what he'll do." My husband, David, was upstairs at that exact moment, unpacking boxes in what would become his home office, completely unaware that a woman neither of us had spoken to since closing day was standing somewhere on the other end of a phone line, terrified enough of him that her voice was shaking through every word. I didn't say anything for a long moment, my mind moving fast, trying to make sense of a sentence that didn't yet have any context I could attach it to. "Mrs. Voss," I finally said, keeping my own voice as level as I could manage, "what exactly is it that you think my husband already knows?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that I genuinely wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke again, her voice had dropped even lower, barely audible, as though she were physically closer to a wall, checking to make sure no one on her end could hear either. "It's about the reason we really sold that house," she whispered. "And it's about something that happened in your basement, that I don't think anyone ever told you about. My name is Rachel Turner. I'm 36 years old, and until that Wednesday night, the biggest decision I thought I'd made all year was choosing the paint color for our new dining room. David and I had been married for 6 years, both of us working steady, unremarkable jobs, mine as a marketing coordinator for a regional healthcare company, his as a project manager for a construction firm outside Denver, Colorado. We'd spent almost 2 years house hunting, patient in a way that occasionally frustrated our realtor, waiting for the exact right property instead of settling for whatever came available first. When we found the house on Larkspur Lane, it felt, almost immediately, like it had been waiting specifically for us. For bedrooms, a finished basement David immediately claimed as his future workshop, a backyard with mature oak trees that made the whole property feel established in a way new construction never quite manages. The sellers, an older couple named Eleanor and Richard Voss, had lived there for nearly 20 years, and everything about the transaction had felt ordinary, almost boringly straightforward, right up until the moment I answered a phone call 1 week after closing and heard a stranger's voice shaking as she asked me not to tell my own husband she'd called. Standing in my kitchen that Wednesday night, I found myself doing something I don't usually do, replaying small details from the closing process that I'd barely registered at the time. Eleanor Voss had seemed nervous during our final walkthrough, I remembered now, hovering near the basement door in a way that had struck me as slightly odd but not alarming enough to comment on. Richard Voss had barely spoken during the entire process, letting his wife handle almost every conversation, which I'd chalked up to simple personality differences between them rather than anything worth examining more closely. David had been the one who handled most of our own communication with their realtor, forwarding me documents to sign, summarizing conversations I hadn't been present for, which felt normal at the time, the kind of practical division of labor most couples fall into during a complicated transaction, but which now, standing in my kitchen with Eleanor's trembling voice still echoing in my ear, felt like something I wanted to look at far more carefully. "What happened in the basement?" I asked her again, my own voice steadier than I expected given how fast my heart was suddenly beating. Eleanor's response came slowly, carefully, like a woman choosing exactly which pieces of a much larger story she was willing to hand over during a single phone call. "I need you to understand something first," she said. "I'm not calling to scare you. I'm calling because I've spent 3 years regretting that we didn't tell the truth when we sold that house, and when I saw your name on the closing documents, young, starting a life there, I couldn't let myself stay silent a second time." 3 years? I asked, my grip tightening slightly around the phone. "You sold us the house 1 week ago, Mrs. Voss. What happened 3 years ago?" She was quiet. Again, long enough that I could hear something in the background on her end, a television maybe, or a radio, turned low. "We didn't sell it 3 years ago," she finally said. "We should have. That's when everything happened. We just didn't find the courage to actually list it until now." Upstairs, I heard David's footsteps crossing the office floor, the particular creak of a specific floorboard I'd already, in just 1 week of living there, started to recognize. My stomach tightened instinctively, some old, animal part of my brain suddenly aware that I needed to keep my voice low, needed this conversation to remain exactly as private as Eleanor herself seemed desperate for it to stay. "Mrs. Voss, I need you to just tell me plainly what you're trying to say," I said quietly, moving further into the kitchen, putting more distance between myself and the staircase. "There was a man," she said, "who used to come to the house sometimes, when Richard was traveling for work. He said his name was Marcus. He told us he was helping David with something, some kind of business arrangement, and honestly, at first, we believed it, because David explained it convincingly enough, and because it wasn't really our business what our neighbor and his friend discussed in a basement." My chest went cold. "David," I repeated slowly. "You're talking about my husband. David used to come to your house before we even bought it?" "He didn't just come to the house," Eleanor said, her voice dropping even further, so quiet now I had to press the phone hard against my ear to catch every word. "Rachel, your husband used to live 3 doors down, in the blue house on the corner, with a woman named Sophie. They were engaged. And Marcus, the man who used to meet him in our basement, he wasn't a business partner. He was Sophie's brother, and he came to that basement more than once trying to convince your husband to end things with Sophie honestly, instead of the way he was actually planning to end them." I stood completely still, feeling the entire foundation of everything I thought I understood about my own husband's history quietly begin to shift beneath me. David had told me, early in our relationship, about a previous engagement that had ended before we met, a brief, painful chapter he rarely discussed in detail and that I, out of respect for what I assumed was simply old heartbreak, had never pushed him to elaborate on. I had never once imagined that chapter had unfolded 3 houses down from the exact home we had just spent 2 years searching for and finally purchased, entirely, it now seemed, without either of us mentioning that connection to the other. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper now, matching the strange, conspiratorial quiet Eleanor herself had established from the very first moment of the call. "Are you telling me David chose this house on purpose? Because of some connection to his ex-fiancée?" Eleanor exhaled slowly on the other end of the line, a sound heavy with something that felt like relief, the particular relief of someone finally setting down a weight they'd been carrying alone for far too long. "I don't know if he chose it consciously," she said. "But Rachel, when your realtor first brought you 2 through for a showing, Richard recognized him immediately. We'd met David several times, years ago, right there in that basement, during a period I can only describe as deeply upsetting for everyone involved. Richard wanted to say something to you both right then, during that very first showing. I talked him out of it. I told him it wasn't our place, that whatever happened between David and Sophie and her brother was old history that had nothing to do with us anymore, and that we simply needed to sell the house and move on with our own lives. But you're calling me now," I said. "Something changed." "Everything changed," Eleanor said, "the day I saw the closing documents and realized you two were actually going through with it, moving into that exact basement, into a house that already held that much unresolved history for your husband. Rachel, I've spent 3 years telling myself it wasn't my responsibility to interfere in whatever happened between David and Sophie. But watching you sign papers to move into that same space, completely unaware of any of it, I couldn't convince myself of that anymore." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, feeling the full weight of the last several minutes finally starting to settle into my body. What actually happened between them? I asked. What was so upsetting that Richard remembered David's face years later? Eleanor's voice dropped again, careful, deliberate. Sophie was already planning their wedding, she said. Venue booked, dress purchased, invitations halfway printed. And your husband was meeting her brother in our basement, secretly, for almost 2 months, trying to figure out how to end the engagement without Sophie's family finding out he'd actually been the one who wanted out, because he was terrified of how it would look, ending things that close to the wedding after everyone had already spent so much money and so much emotional investment preparing for it. I felt something twist uncomfortably in my chest, not quite recognition, not yet, but the early edges of a suspicion I wasn't ready to fully examine over the phone with a stranger. Mrs. Voss, I said carefully, why does any of this matter now, 6 years later? People end engagements. It's difficult, but it's not exactly scandalous. There was a long pause before she answered, long enough that I braced myself instinctively for whatever came next. Because he didn't end it honestly, she finally said. He didn't break things off with Sophie directly at all. Rachel, I think you need to ask your husband exactly how that engagement actually ended, because the version Richard and I witnessed from 3 doors down was very different from a simple, mutual decision to part ways. What do you mean, he didn't end it directly? I asked, my voice tightening with a new, sharper kind of urgency now. Mrs. Voss, please. If you know something, just tell me plainly. I'm not going to hurt you for it, and I'm not going to tell David you called, not until I understand what I'm actually dealing with. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly, steadier now, like a woman who had decided, having come this far, there was no longer any reason to hold back the rest of it. Sophie disappeared 3 weeks before the wedding, she said. Not disappeared like something happened to her, I want to be clear about that. She left. Packed a bag, left in the middle of the night, and nobody in the neighborhood saw or heard from her again for almost 2 years. Her family was devastated. Her brother, Marcus, spent months convinced something terrible had happened, going to the police, putting up flyers. The whole neighborhood was involved in trying to find her. My hands had gone cold around the phone. And David, I said slowly. What did David say happened? That's the thing, Eleanor said. David told everyone, very convincingly, that Sophie had simply gotten cold feet and left on her own, that he had no idea where she'd gone, that he was just as confused and heartbroken as everyone else. And for almost 2 years, that's what the entire neighborhood believed. But you don't believe that, I said, already understanding, somehow, before she confirmed it, that whatever came next was going to be the actual reason for this entire phone call. Richard saw them together, Eleanor said quietly. The week before she disappeared. Sophie and Marcus, loading boxes into a car late at night, 3 streets over, at a house that belonged to a cousin of theirs. Richard didn't say anything at the time, because it wasn't our business, and because David had already built such a convincing story about being blindsided that questioning it felt almost cruel, given how devastated he appeared to be in public. I sat in my kitchen, feeling the shape of an entirely different story beginning to emerge from underneath the one Eleanor had started telling me just minutes earlier, one that no longer felt like a simple tale of an ex-fiancé's disappearance, and had started to feel like something considerably more complicated, something involving my husband's carefully managed public performance of heartbreak, and a truth that apparently only a handful of neighbors, 3 doors down, had ever actually glimpsed. Mrs. Voss, I said carefully, are you telling me Sophie left because of something David did? Not because she got cold feet, but because she was actually running from him? The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I understood, before Eleanor even said another word, that whatever answer was coming next was going to change considerably more than just my understanding of my husband's past. I don't know the full truth of it, Eleanor admitted finally, and I want to be honest with you about that, because I don't want you thinking I have answers I don't actually have. What I know is what Richard saw, and what I overheard, once, through our basement wall, during one of the last times Marcus came to talk to David before Sophie left. What did you hear? I asked, barely breathing now. Marcus was angry, Eleanor said. Angrier than I'd ever heard a person sound in our own home. He kept saying the same thing, over and over, something about David needing to let her go, needing to stop showing up at her work, needing to stop calling her family asking where she was staying. And David kept insisting he had a right to know, that she was still his fiancée, that nobody had the right to hide her from him. I felt something cold settle into my stomach, a specific, physical dread that had nothing to do with old history and everything to do with a pattern I suddenly, uncomfortably, recognized. 2 years into our own relationship, before David and I were married, there had been a period where I'd needed space, a difficult stretch after my mother's cancer diagnosis, when I'd asked David to give me a few days alone to process everything without him checking in constantly. I remembered, now, with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself in years, how persistent he'd been during that period, showing up at my apartment unannounced, calling my sister when I didn't answer his texts within an hour, insisting it was simply because he loved me too much to give me the distance I'd asked for. At the time, I had found it touching, evidence of how deeply he cared. Sitting in my kitchen now, listening to Eleanor describe an almost identical pattern from 6 years earlier, I felt that old memory rearrange itself into something considerably less romantic than I had once believed it to be. "Mrs. Voss," I said slowly, "did Sophie ever come back? Did anyone ever find out for certain what actually happened, why she really left?" "She came back once," Eleanor said. "About 18 months after she disappeared, just to collect the rest of her things from her parents' house. Richard saw her from our front porch. She looked thin, Rachel, thin and tired in a way that worried him enough that he actually went over to say hello, just to check on her." "What did she say?" Eleanor's voice dropped again, careful, deliberate, the way it had been throughout the entire call whenever she was about to say something she clearly still felt uneasy repeating. "She told Richard she'd left because David had started monitoring her phone, tracking where she went during the day, showing up unannounced at places she hadn't told him she'd be. She said the wedding planning had become less about marrying him and more about surviving him long enough to get away safely, and that Marcus had helped her plan the exact night she finally left, because she was too afraid to do it alone." I sat completely still in my kitchen chair, the phone pressed hard against my ear, feeling the last 6 years of my own marriage rearranging themselves in real time around a story I had never once heard, not even in the smallest, softened version David had occasionally offered when Sophie's name came up. He had told me she left because she got scared of commitment. He had told me it took him almost 2 years to fully recover from the heartbreak of it. He had never once mentioned tracking her phone, showing up unannounced at her workplace, or the fact that her own brother had needed to help her plan an escape late at night rather than simply ending an engagement the ordinary, difficult, but ultimately survivable way most people do. "Mrs. Voss," I said, my voice steadier now than I expected, "why didn't you or Richard ever say anything? Not to Sophie's family at the time, not to me during the sale, not to anyone?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, I could hear something that sounded almost like shame threading through her words. "Because it wasn't proof of anything," she said. It was a conversation overheard through a basement wall, and a woman who looked tired when she came back to collect her things. What were we supposed to do with that? Go to the police with second-hand impressions and half a conversation? Richard wanted to say something to David directly, once, right after Sophie left, and I told him not to. I told him it wasn't our business, that we didn't actually know enough to accuse anyone of anything, and I've regretted that decision every single day since, especially now, watching you move into that same house with him, completely unaware. I thought about David upstairs, still unpacking boxes, completely unaware that I was sitting in our kitchen absorbing a version of his history that bore almost no resemblance to the one he'd carefully constructed for me over the past 6 years. "Do you know where Sophie is now?" I asked. "I don't," Eleanor admitted. "She moved out of state not long after that final visit to collect her things. Marcus moved with her, I believe, though I couldn't tell you exactly where. I've thought about trying to find her over the years, to apologize for not saying something sooner, but I never worked up the courage." I sat with that for a moment, absorbing not just what Eleanor had told me, but what she hadn't, the parts of this story that remained just out of reach, buried somewhere in a history my own husband had spent 6 years carefully editing before ever sharing any piece of it with me. "Mrs. Voss," I finally said, "why are you telling me this now, specifically? You could have called before we signed the closing papers. You could have said something during any of our walkthroughs. Why tonight, 1 week after we've already moved in? Her answer, when it came, landed with a weight I hadn't fully braced myself for. Because Richard saw your husband's car outside Sophie's old childhood home 3 days ago, she said quietly. The house is empty now, has been for years, her parents moved away long ago. But David was parked outside it for almost 20 minutes, Rachel, just sitting there, watching the house. And that's when I finally understood that whatever this was, it wasn't actually finished for him, not completely, and that you deserved to know that before it became your problem to discover on your own. I sat in absolute silence after Eleanor said that, the phone growing warm against my ear, my mind racing through the last several months trying to place any moment where David might have disappeared for 20 unexplained minutes without my noticing. There had been evenings, I realized now, evenings I'd previously filed away without a second thought, when he'd come home slightly later than expected from work, offering a quick, plausible explanation, traffic on the highway, a last-minute meeting that ran long, nothing that had ever struck me as suspicious at the time because I had never had any reason to look for suspicion in the first place. Mrs. Voss, I said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, even if it's difficult to say. Do you think David is dangerous? Not just dishonest about his past, but actually dangerous, to me or to anyone else? Eleanor took a long breath before answering, the kind of breath that told me she had been asking herself that exact question for years without ever landing on an answer she felt fully confident in. I don't know, she admitted. I never saw him hurt anyone physically, not once, not in all the years we lived 3 doors down from that relationship. What I saw was a man who couldn't let go, who confused control for love, who built an entire public narrative of victimhood around a situation where, from everything Richard and I actually witnessed, he was the one causing the harm. Whether that makes him dangerous in the way you're asking, I honestly can't tell you for certain. But Rachel, I don't think it's a risk worth taking without knowing the full truth first. I thought about the man upstairs, the man I had married, the man who brought me coffee every morning without being asked, who had cried, genuinely cried, at our wedding when I walked down the aisle, who had spent the last week patiently assembling furniture and hanging pictures in our new home, seemingly thrilled about the life we were building together. That version of David existed. I knew that version intimately, had built 6 years of marriage around trusting that version completely. But sitting in my kitchen now, listening to a stranger describe an entirely different version of the same man, a version capable of monitoring a fiancé's phone, showing up unannounced at her workplace, sitting simultaneously, and that understanding terrified me more than any single piece of information Eleanor had shared. Throughout the entire call. What do you think I should do? I asked quietly, genuinely uncertain, for the first time in longer than I could remember, of what my own next move should actually be. Eleanor's answer came slowly, carefully, the answer of a woman who had clearly thought about this exact question many times over the past week since realizing who had actually purchased her old home. I think you need to find out the truth for yourself, she said, carefully, quietly, before you say anything to him directly. Because Rachel, if even half of what Richard and I witnessed is accurate, the version of David you confront needs to be confronted with proof, not suspicion. Suspicion he can explain away. Proof, he can't. After Eleanor and I finally hung up, I sat alone in my kitchen for nearly an hour, listening to the house settle around me, listening for David's footsteps upstairs, trying to reconcile the ordinary sounds of him unpacking boxes with everything I had just learned about the man making them. I didn't go up to bed that night until I heard him finally turn off the office light and head into our bedroom himself, and even then, I lay beside him in the dark for a long time, matching my breathing to his, pretending to be asleep, running through every detail Eleanor had shared, searching for the exact starting point of whatever careful investigation I now understood I needed to conduct. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I almost never do, and instead drove to the county courthouse downtown, sitting in the Public Records Division for almost 3 hours, searching through old newspaper archives on a library microfilm machine I hadn't used since college. It took time, more time than I expected, but eventually I found it, a small missing persons notice from 6 years earlier, buried on page 14 of the local paper. Sophie Marlowe, 26 years old, last seen leaving her fiancé's residence, family requesting any information regarding her whereabouts. The notice included a photograph, a young woman with dark hair and a nervous, uncertain smile, nothing like the confident, composed photographs David kept in an old box in our closet, the handful of pictures he'd shown me once, early in our relationship, of a happier chapter before everything, according to him, had fallen apart. I photographed the notice with my phone, my hand steady in a way that surprised me, given how unsteady I'd felt just hours earlier sitting in my kitchen. From the courthouse, I drove to the address Eleanor had given me for Sophie's childhood home, the empty house David had apparently been watching just 3 days earlier. It sat quiet and unremarkable on a tree-lined street not far from our own new neighborhood, a faded for sale sign leaning slightly in the front yard, curtains drawn across every window. I sat in my car outside it for several minutes, trying to imagine my husband parked in this exact spot, watching this exact house, 6 years after the woman who once lived there had fled him in the middle of the night. I didn't have proof yet, not the kind of undeniable, comprehensive proof Eleanor had warned me I would need before confronting David directly. But I had a starting thread now, a missing persons notice, a neighbor's first-hand account, a pattern of behavior that lined up disturbingly well with certain moments from my own relationship I had previously interpreted as devotion rather than control. I drove home that afternoon with a plan forming clearly in my mind, the same methodical, patient approach I'd use for any complicated project at work: gather everything first, verify every detail independently, and only then, once the full picture was undeniable, decide exactly how to move forward with the man sleeping beside me every night, still completely unaware that I now knew considerably more about his past than he had ever intended for me to discover. Over the following 2 weeks, I built a careful, quiet investigation around the edges of my own marriage, the same disciplined patience I would bring to any complex project, except this project involved documenting the history of the man I had promised to spend my life with. I found Marcus first, Sophie's brother, through a professional networking site, using a photograph Eleanor had described well enough that I recognized him immediately from an old, tagged photo buried on Sophie's long-abandoned social media account. I messaged him carefully, explaining who I was, why I was reaching out, and within a day he called me directly, his voice tight with the same wary caution Eleanor's had carried during that first phone call. I always wondered if he'd do this again, Marcus said quietly, once I'd explained everything Eleanor had told me. Marry someone else, move into a life that looked normal from the outside. I used to check, sometimes, to make sure Sophie was still safe, still far enough away that he couldn't find her again. Is she safe? I asked, my chest tightening at the phrase "find her again," a phrase that told me considerably more about the true scope of what had happened than any single previous detail had managed to convey. She's safe, Marcus confirmed. She moved across the country, changed her last name legally about 4 years ago, mostly out of caution rather than any specific new threat. She's married now, has a daughter, has built an entirely new life. But Rachel, I want you to understand something clearly. What David did to her wasn't a single bad period in an otherwise normal relationship. It escalated for almost a year before she finally left, slowly, in small increments that made it hard for her to recognize how serious it had actually become until she was already deeply trapped inside it. Over the next hour, Marcus told me things that confirmed and expanded everything Eleanor had already shared: the tracked phone, the unannounced appearances at Sophie's workplace, a period near the end where David had gone through her emails without permission, convinced, based on nothing concrete, that she was planning to leave him for someone else, an accusation that turned out to be devastatingly ironic, given that her actual plan, by that point, had simply been to leave him for her own safety and sanity, with no other person involved at all. How did she finally get out? I asked. We planned it for almost 3 weeks, Marcus said. Quietly, carefully, making sure he never suspected anything different from her usual routine, until the night she finally left everything behind and drove 6 hours to stay with our cousin, the same night Eleanor's husband apparently saw us loading boxes into a car. I sat with the full weight of that story settling over me, understanding now, with total clarity, exactly what kind of careful, patient escape I might eventually need to plan myself, unless I could find some way to confront David directly and safely, with enough undeniable proof that denial would no longer be possible, and enough careful planning that whatever came next wouldn't put me in the same danger Sophie had apparently spent nearly a year quietly, desperately trying to escape that I didn't. Confront David that week, or the week after, because everything Marcus and Eleanor had told me convinced me that timing mattered more than urgency, that the safest version of this conversation was one I approached fully prepared rather than one I stumbled into out of raw emotional impulse. Instead, I spent those weeks doing what I do best professionally, building a careful, documented record, saving screenshots of old messages between David and me that, viewed now through this new lens, read very differently than they had at the time. Moments where he'd expressed frustration about me spending a weekend with my sister without checking in enough. Times he'd called my workplace directly when I hadn't answered a text within what he considered a reasonable window. Patterns I had genuinely, honestly interpreted as devotion throughout 6 years of marriage, and now understood, with a clarity that made my stomach turn, as something considerably less benign. I contacted a family attorney, quietly, during my lunch break one afternoon, a woman named Patricia Hensley who specialized, I learned during our consultation, in exactly this kind of complicated, potentially dangerous separation. The fact that you're being this careful, she told me during our first meeting, the fact that you're gathering information before confronting him rather than reacting immediately, that's actually the safest possible approach, especially given the history you've just described to me. Men who exhibit this specific pattern of controlling behavior often become considerably more dangerous in the immediate aftermath of losing control, which means the safety planning matters just as much as the legal planning. She helped me understand, over that first consultation and several that followed, exactly what a safe separation would need to look like: a secured new lease signed under my name alone before David knew anything was happening, financial accounts quietly separated in advance, a clear, documented paper trail establishing the pattern of behavior in case any future legal protection became necessary. I found myself, over those 2 careful weeks, living an almost entirely dual existence, coming home each evening to a husband who remained affectionate, attentive, seemingly thrilled about our new life together, while privately building an exit strategy one prayed, with an intensity one hadn't prayed for anything in years, I would ultimately be able to execute safely. I thought often, during that period, about Sophie, a woman I had never met, who had once lived 3 houses down from what was now my own home, who had spent nearly a year in a relationship with the same man I had married, slowly recognizing the same patterns I was only now beginning to fully understand, and who had ultimately needed her own brother's careful help simply to leave safely in the middle of the night. I understood, building my own quiet plan during those 2 weeks, that I was walking a path she had already walked once before, 6 years earlier, in the exact same neighborhood, and that understanding gave me a strange, steadying kind of resolve, the knowledge that whatever came next, I wasn't facing it entirely alone, even if David never knew, until the very end, exactly how much I had already learned that I didn't confront David that week, or the week after, because everything Marcus and Eleanor had told me convinced me that timing mattered more than urgency, that the safest version of this conversation was one I approached fully prepared rather than one I stumbled into out of raw emotional impulse. Instead, I spent those weeks doing what I do best professionally, building a careful, documented record, saving screenshots of old messages between David and me that, viewed now through this new lens, read very differently than they had at the time. Moments where he'd expressed frustration about me spending a weekend with my sister without checking in enough. Times he'd called my workplace directly when I hadn't answered a text within what he considered a reasonable window. Patterns I had genuinely, honestly interpreted as devotion throughout 6 years of marriage, and now understood, with a clarity that made my stomach turn, as something considerably less benign. I contacted a family attorney, quietly, during my lunch break one afternoon, a woman named Patricia Hensley who specialized, I learned during our consultation, in exactly this kind of complicated, potentially dangerous separation. The fact that you're being this careful, she told me during our first meeting, the fact that you're gathering information before confronting him rather than reacting immediately, that's actually the safest possible approach, especially given the history you've just described to me. Men who exhibit this specific pattern of controlling behavior often become considerably more dangerous in the immediate aftermath of losing control, which means the safety planning matters just as much as the legal planning. She helped me understand, over that first consultation and several that followed, exactly what a safe separation would need to look like: a secured new lease signed under my name alone before David knew anything was happening, financial accounts quietly separated in advance, a clear, documented paper trail establishing the pattern of behavior in case any future legal protection became necessary. I found myself, over those 2 careful weeks, living an almost entirely dual existence, coming home each evening to a husband who remained affectionate, attentive, seemingly thrilled about our new life together, while privately building an exit strategy one prayed, with an intensity one hadn't prayed for anything in years, I would ultimately be able to execute safely. I thought often, during that period, about Sophie, a woman I had never met, who had once lived 3 houses down from what was now my own home, who had spent nearly a year in a relationship with the same man I had married, slowly recognizing the same patterns I was only now beginning to fully understand, and who had ultimately needed her own brother's careful help simply to leave safely in the middle of the night. I understood, building my own quiet plan during those 2 weeks, that I was walking a path she had already walked once before, 6 years earlier, in the exact same neighborhood, and that understanding gave me a strange, steadying kind of resolve, the knowledge that whatever came next, I wasn't facing it entirely alone, even if David never knew, until the very end, exactly how much I had already learned. The night I finally left, I had been planning it for exactly 19 days, every detail arranged with the same careful precision Marcus had described Sophie using 6 years earlier, a new apartment secured across town under a lease David knew nothing about, my most important documents and a single packed bag already stored quietly in the trunk of my car, Patricia's number saved under a false contact name in my phone in case anything went wrong during the transition. David had a late meeting that evening, a detail I had confirmed independently through his assistant under the pretense of coordinating a surprise, which gave me a window I had calculated carefully would be enough time to leave without confrontation, the exact same strategy, I understood with a strange, sad clarity, that Sophie and Marcus had used all those years earlier. I moved through the house that final evening with a steadiness that surprised even me, taking only what Patricia had advised, important documents, a small amount of jewelry that had belonged to my mother, nothing that would signal, to anyone glancing casually around the house, that a departure this permanent had actually occurred. I left a note on the kitchen counter, brief and carefully worded with Patricia's guidance, explaining only that I needed space and would be in contact through my attorney, nothing that revealed how much I actually knew, nothing that gave him any specific target to focus his anger toward. I drove to my new apartment with my hands steady on the wheel, the same steadiness I imagined Sophie must have found somewhere within herself during her own 6-hour drive to safety years earlier, and when I finally unlocked the door to a space that belonged entirely to me, unknown to David, unconnected to any part of the life we had built together, I sat down on the floor of an empty living room and allowed myself, for the first time in 19 days, to fully feel the weight of everything that had happened since that trembling phone call from a stranger I had never met in person. David texted that night, increasingly frantic messages arriving every 20 minutes, confusion shifting slowly into anger, anger shifting into something that read, even through text, as barely controlled desperation. I didn't respond to a single message, following Patricia's careful guidance precisely, letting my attorney handle all future communication instead, removing myself entirely from any direct exchange that might allow him the opening to talk his way back into influence over my decisions. 3 days later, David showed up at my workplace, exactly as Marcus had warned me he might, and exactly as Patricia had prepared me for, security escorting him from the building after I calmly, from a safe distance, confirmed to my office manager that I did not want to speak with him and had a legal restriction already in place preventing direct contact. Watching him escorted out through the glass doors of my office lobby, visibly furious, visibly humiliated, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel this early in the process, not fear exactly, though fear was certainly still present somewhere underneath everything else, but a clear, steady confirmation that everything Eleanor, Marcus, and Patricia had warned me about had turned out to be entirely, devastatingly accurate. The legal proceedings that followed took nearly 8 months to fully resolve, complicated considerably by the pattern of behavior Patricia and I had spent those careful 19 days documenting, which ultimately proved essential once David's own escalating behavior during the separation began confirming, in real time, everything I had learned secondhand about his history with Sophie. He contacted my family members repeatedly despite the restraining order Patricia helped me secure. He drove past my new apartment on several documented occasions, always claiming, when questioned through our respective attorneys, some innocent, coincidental explanation that grew progressively less believable with each repetition. Marcus, once he learned the divorce proceedings were underway, offered to provide a formal statement regarding the pattern he had witnessed with Sophie years earlier, an offer Patricia gratefully accepted, explaining that establishing prior pattern, even from a relationship that predated our marriage entirely, could meaningfully strengthen the protective measures we were seeking. I never did make direct contact with Sophie herself, respecting the new life and new name she had carefully built for herself across the country, though Marcus did eventually pass along a brief message from her, relayed rather than direct, simply saying she was glad I had gotten out safely, and sooner than she had managed to. That message, secondhand and brief as it was, meant more to me during those difficult months than almost anything else that happened throughout the entire process, a quiet confirmation from the one person who truly understood, from first-hand experience, exactly what I had escaped. The house on Larkspur Lane sold within 3 months of the divorce proceedings beginning, David eager, according to Patricia's contacts, to distance himself from a property that had apparently become deeply uncomfortable for him once he understood the full extent of what Eleanor and Richard Voss had witnessed and eventually shared. I never learned who the new owners were, and I found myself hoping, somewhat irrationally, that Eleanor would find whatever version of peace she'd been searching for since that first trembling phone call, having finally, after 3 years of silent regret, done something concrete to interrupt a pattern she'd watched unfold once already from 3 doors down. I called her once, near the end of the proceedings, simply to thank her properly for what her courage that Wednesday night had ultimately allowed me to avoid. She cried on the phone, admitting she had spent every day since that call wondering if she'd said too much, or not enough, or whether I had believed her at all during those first disorienting minutes of a conversation that had upended everything I thought I understood about my own marriage. "You saved my life," I told her honestly, and I meant it completely, understanding by that point exactly how differently my own story might have unfolded had she chosen, as she had once before with Sophie, to stay silent rather than risk the discomfort of speaking an uncomfortable truth to a stranger she had no obligation to warn at all. A year after that first phone call, I sat in a small apartment I had chosen entirely for myself, no compromise, no careful negotiation, no lingering trace of a life built around managing someone else's control disguised as devotion. I had rebuilt my career during that year with a focus and clarity I hadn't expected to find so quickly after everything that happened, throwing myself into work in a way that felt less like avoidance and more like genuine reclamation of a part of my identity that had, I slowly realized looking back, been quietly narrowing for years without my full awareness. My sister, who had been deeply confused during those first difficult weeks by my sudden, unexplained departure from a marriage that had looked, from the outside, entirely happy, finally understood the full story once the legal proceedings allowed me to share it safely, and her reaction, somewhere between horror and fierce protectiveness, mirrored almost exactly what I imagine Marcus must have felt watching his own sister navigate the same terrifying pattern 6 years earlier. I thought often, during that first year of rebuilding, about the strange, specific chain of circumstances that had ultimately saved me, a neighbor's quiet regret finally outweighing her hesitation, a phone call made at exactly the right moment, 1 week after closing, before David and I had fully settled into a life that might have made leaving considerably harder. I understood, with a clarity that still occasionally surprised me, how easily this story could have unfolded differently, how many versions of it existed where Eleanor never called at all, where I never followed the thread she offered me carefully enough to find Marcus, where I might have spent years, as Sophie once had, slowly, painfully recognizing a pattern that was somehow both obvious and invisible from directly inside it. I started volunteering, that year, with a local organization supporting women navigating exactly the kind of controlling relationship I had narrowly escaped, offering my own story, carefully and selectively, to women just beginning to recognize patterns in their own relationships that I understood now, better than I ever wanted to, from first-hand, painful experience. It felt important, somehow, to transform what had happened into something that might help interrupt the same pattern for someone else, the way Eleanor's courage had ultimately interrupted it for me, a chain of women, essentially strangers to each other, quietly helping one another recognize danger before it became permanent. I never remarried, not in that first year, though I found myself, slowly and cautiously, opening back up to the possibility of trust again, understanding now, with a hard-won clarity, exactly what genuine devotion actually feels like, steady and generous rather than controlling and possessive, patient rather than anxious, secure enough to give space rather than desperate enough to monitor every moment of it. I still think about that Wednesday night sometimes, standing in my half-unpacked kitchen, answering a call from a number I didn't recognize, hearing a stranger's voice shaking as she asked me not to tell my husband she'd called. I think about how close I came to simply hanging up, to dismissing that first trembling sentence as some kind of strange mistake, to walking upstairs that night and falling asleep beside a man I still, at that point, genuinely believed I knew completely. I think about Eleanor Voss, 3 years of silent regret finally outweighing her fear, choosing, at the exact right moment, to interrupt a pattern she had watched unfold once already from 3 doors down, never knowing for certain, until months later when I finally called to thank her, whether her courage that night had actually mattered at all. I think about Sophie, a woman I never met, whose careful, desperate escape 6 years earlier ultimately became the blueprint that saved my own life. Her brother's help, her friend's silence broken years too late but not too late to matter, a chain of quiet courage spanning 6 years in 2 different women's lives, connected by nothing more than a house on Larkspur Lane and a man who had never actually changed at all, no matter how many years passed or how many new beginnings he attempted to construct around the same underlying pattern. I built an entirely new life out of the wreckage of that one Wednesday phone call, a life that belongs completely to me now, steady, honest, free of the quiet, patient control I had once mistaken for devotion throughout 6 years of marriage. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, I want to ask you something honestly, something I've thought about often since that first trembling phone call changed everything I believed about my own life. If a stranger called you tonight, shaking, afraid, asking you not to tell someone you loved that they'd reached out, would you have the courage to listen all the way through, the way I finally did, even when everything in you wanted to hang up and pretend the life you thought you were living was still exactly as safe and certain as it had felt just minutes earlier? Tell me honestly, in the comments, where you're watching this from tonight, and whether you've ever had a moment like mine, a single phone call, a single conversation that changed everything you thought you understood about someone you trusted completely. And if this story reached something real in you tonight, stay close, because there are so many more stories like mine still waiting to be told, and I would truly, deeply love to have you here with me again for the next one.